I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey this morning, a progress, if you will, along a part of my own adventurous path of discovery with George MacDonald. It's far from over. I'm still a pilgrim. I've taken a lot of pauses in libraries filled with other books, stopped in houses hosted by grandmotherly women, meandered down paths which were perhaps not for me, and even at times, like MacDonald's character Adela Cathcart, lain ineffectually on a couch, requiring the intervention of friends to be sufficiently fortified before carrying on. And whenever I do pick up the thread again, I admit I can feel overwhelmed by the multifaceted, yet albeit fascinating path that spins out before me. About 30 years ago, in my early 20s, I rediscovered George MacDonald. Needing a break from a paper I was supposed to be writing on Pilgrim's Progress, I picked up The Golden Key off of a friend's bookshelf, a book I hadn't read since my early teens. It was delightful to rediscover Tangle and Mossy, the green-haired grandmother, the old men. And I wasn't surprised to recognize hints from Narnia here and there in the tale. What I hadn't expected was to be finding hints of Pilgrim's Progress as well. And what seemed to be more than hints, perhaps even a response to John Bunyan's tale. Suddenly my initial plan for the Bunyan paper was out the window, and I was off to the library to find out more about this man, MacDonald, whose stories I had loved as a child, but about whom I knew very little. The library didn't have masses of material, but with what it did have, I was able to build up a picture. I was excited to discover that not only could I easily establish that MacDonald was indeed a close reader of Bunyan, but that he and his family had gained some renown for their performances of Pilgrim's Progress. I was somewhat thrown by the fact that the only critical writing I could find specifically on the Golden Key assured me that the key was a phallic symbol and that MacDonald's writing was determined by frustrated desires, quote, and a lifelong angst induced by deprivation of breast milk as an infant. Not quite the explication I had expected, but I remained nonetheless fascinated by the author that was emerging, and I began to wonder about doing more than simply a class paper on MacDonald. Here was, so I read, a rural preacher who, despite a childhood of oppressive and dour Calvinism that warned against the evils of such things as fiddle music and fairy tales, had somehow risen above his circumstances to become one of the grandfathers of modern fantasy. Having escaped the narrowness of a small backwater town, MacDonald's world was transformed at university, and especially by his accidental discovery of German romantics. This serendipity was essentially his salvation, so I read, for as a failed preacher kicked out of his church, MacDonald turned to writing fiction in order to feed his ever-growing family. Although his first novel, Fantastes, was pretty much universally scorned when it came out, MacDonald's realistic novels were more popular, and through them and the Pilgrim's Progress performances, he was able to keep things going. A failed preacher turned novelist, and fortunately fantasist as well, as his non-religious and at times even anti-religious fantasy is the only reason he was still being read in the 20th century. That's the picture I gleaned from the text to which I had access 30 years ago. And that's pretty much how I presented him to others, with the exception of the non- or anti-religious fantasy bit. I hadn't reread enough of the fantasy to be cocksure, but even the little that I had reread, there was a lot of reiteration of Bible verses and even explicit and positive references to God. So that perspective seemed a little problematic to me, but it did add to my curiosity. How did this creative writer appear out of nowhere, crafting these amazing tales? Tales that, so I discovered the more reading that I did, had been such an influence on so many other great writers. Chesterton, Lewis, Tolkien, James Barrie, Nesbit, Longo, Le Guin, Sendak, Buchner. A storyteller for storytellers, really. A pioneer whose work was to inform not only 20th century fantasists, but now continues to impact fantasists of the 21st century. Like many other folk I knew, I had C.S. Lewis's anthology of George MacDonald's quotations sitting unread on my shelf. So I pulled it down and perused the introduction. What Lewis wrote certainly countered the claims that MacDonald's fantasy was non-religious, and while he gave mixed reviews on MacDonald's style, he clearly adulated MacDonald's ability to craft stories that could change lives, and not just his own. He connected this with MacDonald's gift of what he called the mythopoeic. Lewis also included a bit of biography, but it was limited in detail, and I now realize limited in accuracy as well. And so I began a new stage of my journey, a foray into primary material. Thus, too, began a very protracted reconstruction of my image of who MacDonald was and what he did. The more I read about MacDonald's home and childhood, the more nuanced my understanding of that environment became. The same happened with his early experiences as a preacher and as a novelist. I became addicted to library and university archives because in these, both in the UK and in North America, I was discovering letters and memoirs that were not only filling in missing pieces, but were sometimes directly contradicting received truths that had been passed down about his biography and his writing. Passed down, albeit in good faith, through the 20th century scholarship that I had read. I'd like to add in here that the older I get, and the more mistakes I realize that I have made in my scholarship, the greater my grace for the mistakes of others, I hope. I'm trying to be so, and to own my own. I even discovered, as I was doing this primary research, that some of the published letters had been abbreviated, or had portions of sentences removed without acknowledgement, even to the extent of altering my reception of the meaning of those sentences. And suddenly MacDonald was not looking anything like the description I gave you a moment ago. Nor was he appearing quite the miracle child he once seemed. Rather, he was emerging as an almost predictable product of his environment, once one knew what that environment actually was. Instead of a catch-all Calvinist childhood, I discovered a man whose father clearly articulated his desire for God over denomination, who was willing to discuss varying doctrines, and openly voiced his desire to continue to grow and change in how he perceived the divine. With his father, MacDonald's grandfather, a Catholic-born, fiddle-playing Presbyterian elder, his mother an independent church rebel, his first wife, MacDonald's mother, a sister to the Gaelic-speaking radical who became moderator of the First Disrupting Church, and his second wife, MacDonald's stepmother, to whom MacDonald was very close, the daughter of a Celtic Episcopalian minister, merely using the sweepingly generalized tag as Calvinist for his son's theological upbringing, began to seem both simplistic and misleading. The church of MacDonald's childhood is sometimes in literature described as Cowie's church, followed by a rather damning description of Reverend Cowie's fundamentalism. But I quickly discovered that aside from the fact that Cowie's theology is said to have changed fairly dramatically from when he founded the church to when he retired from the post, Cowie actually died a full 20 years before MacDonald was even born. Hardly a key influence on him personally. And MacDonald himself was no miracle aberration from that congregation. If anything, it was the congregation itself that was an aberration. Amongst MacDonald's childhood peers at that church, there emerged, and this is just from his peers alone, his group of compatriots, a Celtic scholar, at least 3 biblical scholars, a doctor of divinity, 3 journal editors, 2 church denomination moderators, several pastors and missionaries, and Britain's first sinologist, Asian scholar, who taught in Oxford and whose work is still today studied in China, James Legge. That's some youth group. And in case anyone's tempted to think these pursuits were considered deviant from the childhood community in which MacDonald grew up, not only was MacDonald invited back to Huntley to lecture on Tennyson, But the sinologist James Legge was also invited back to small, rural Scottish Huntly to lecture on Confucius. As I delved, I also learned that not only were fairy tales and fiction not banned from MacDonald's childhood, as a few sources had assured me that they were, MacDonald was actually raised in an unusually literate environment. For example, one of MacDonald's maternal uncles was a famed Celtic scholar and editor of the Gaelic Highland Dictionary. He collected fairy tales and Celtic poetry in the midst of his campaign to keep the Gaelic language and culture alive. MacDonald's paternal grandfather had supported the publication of an edition of Ossian, that controversial Celtic text that some claimed kicked off European Romanticism and was certainly key to Goethe's Young Werther. MacDonald's step-uncle was a Shakespeare scholar, his paternal cousin another Celtic scholar, and his parents were both readers. His dad with an acknowledged penchant for Burns, Newton, Cooper, Chalmers, Coleridge, and Darwin, to name but a few, and his mother with a classical education that included multiple languages. In reflections on his childhood, MacDonald speaks of reading Arabian Nights obsessively, of loving, if not understanding, his father's copy of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and of initiating his passion for Shakespeare. As a youth, he actually delighted in reading Paradise Lost whilst flung across the back of his horse. MacDonald's schoolmaster recollected him regaling classmates with legends of the local castle, and MacDonald and his cousins regularly taught Bible stories in Sunday school. This was not a wonder child, deprived of literature and story, yet miraculously discovering it. MacDonald's upbringing was unusually rich in family-sanctioned Western literary tradition. And all this in addition to the remarkable Scottish education system from which he clearly benefited. In his primary school in Huntly, this education included not only rhetoric, mathematics, and French, but also the study of classics in Latin and Greek. At some point in this reconstruction, it hit home to me that, heck, MacDonald didn't even grow up right in Huntly. He grew up on a farm outside of Huntly. And it's somewhat ironic that it took so long for this to sink in for me, as I grew up on a farm. And perhaps only if you did too, or had friends or family who did, will you know just how substantially different the upbringing of a farm kid is from a townie. It's an important part of his biography that he's a farm kid. I even learned that the frequent representation of the negative reception of Fantastes that I referenced earlier was suspect. Once I started to look at the actual contemporary reviews of the book, I found many more positive ones than negative ones. The secondhand symbol shop review that is so frequently quoted is colorful and conveniently dramatic, but it's not at all representative. In fact, 3 years after Fantastes was published, journals actually declared the novel, quote, a very decided success. Yet despite my increasing familiarity with and reconfiguration of MacDonald's biography, there was one piece that still hadn't really shifted for me. I still saw MacDonald as a preacher turned author. What finally woke me up to just how wrong that image was my return to that word used by Lewis to describe MacDonald's fiction, mythopoeic. Lewis, as you may recall, calls MacDonald the greatest genius in, quote, what may be even one of the greatest arts, mythopoiesis. That's a pretty high accolade, the greatest genius in what may even be one of the greatest arts. I discovered that Tolkien had also used the term of MacDonald. So too had their student W.H. Auden. As all three men were not only successful writers, but also highly respected literature scholars and professors, I decided to try to suss out what exactly they meant by the term, to see if this would help me better figure out how a failed minister ended up becoming such a great storycrafter. So I turned aside from MacDonald for a bit and looked at how Tolkien and Lewis used this word. And as I've detailed my discoveries on this elsewhere, I won't be exhaustive here, but I do believe that clarity on certain aspects of the term can enable significant insight into MacDonald's import and impact as a foundational fantasist. The written and verbal discussions Tolkien and Lewis held about this great art reintroduced it to the public consciousness. And in the process, they identified MacDonald as a prime practitioner. Often today, the word mythopoeic is used to mean literary myth, or it's even used as simply an adjective describing something reminiscent of Middle-earth or Narnia. At its most broad, it is no more than a synonym for fantasy. But it's important that we as literature scholars, and most particularly those interested in fantasy and or the Inklings, recognize that this is not how Lewis or Tolkien used the term. Indeed, for them, the word was not even restricted to the genre of fantasy, although they did argue that that realm lends itself particularly well to it. Understanding mythopoeic as applied by those Oxford literature professors who became some of the century's greatest fantasy authors can shed light not only on their own literary creations and those of MacDonald, but actually also on those who can be considered following in that lineage. Writers like Le Guin and Longueuil, Gaiman, Clarke, Overstreet, Trafton, the Petersons. Tolkien and Lewis's understanding of mythopoiesis was finessed by their engagement with the ideas of another Inkling, Owen Barfield. Barfield, better known as a philosopher and author of books such as Poetic Diction and the History of English Words, was actually also himself a fantasist, having authored The Silver Trumpet. Barfield and Lewis had been friends since undergraduate days. They were delighted when they discovered that Tolkien too was a lover of language and myth, and that he similarly valued imagination. And soon the three of them were having deep discussions around the subject. These discussions had some pretty significant long-term consequences, which you can read about in multiple biographies of Lewis now. But I'll just touch on some of the key ones that relate to the purposes of this introductory lecture. First, they concurred that a myth is a story out of which ever varying meanings will grow for different recipients in different ages, and that there exists both factual and fictive myths. For instance, they would call the Christian gospel a myth, not meaning that it did not happen, but rather that regardless of whether it happened or not, its story is one that has persisted across time and cultures and has repeatedly been considered relevant by at least some part of the population, despite how incredibly different that population's culture might be from that out of which the story first came. For example, consider the difference between 1930s Britain and first century Middle East. A mythopoeic work such as MacDonald seemed to be able to craft was one that not only had transcendent potential, but also within the space of its secondary world, bore the potential for a transformative experience on the part of the reader. Not that a reader would necessarily be changed in how they saw or engaged with the primary world once they had set the tale aside, but the possibility was there. Think of Tolkien's King Theoden and the many readers who have journeyed with him in Rohan, who forever look at trees with new eyes after having met Ents. Or like Lewis's Lucy and the many readers who have journeyed with her on the Dawn Treader, for whom the phrase, "that is only what a star is made of," is somehow deeply satisfying. The change could be seemingly minor or clearly revolutionary, but something about who you are or how or what you see is different. Although Chesterton, preceding Barfield, Tolkien, and Lewis, never used the word mythopoeic, his assertions readily concur with Lewis as to MacDonald's mythopoeic gift. Chesterton claims that reading The Princess and the Goblin, more than anything he had ever read, changed his way of engaging with, of viewing the entire world. It made, to use Chesterton's own phrase, a difference to my whole existence. Lewis, as you know, made a similar claim of MacDonald's Phantastes. Much of what Lewis and Tolkien discussed with Barfield, they later wrote about in essays such as on fairy tales and on stories. And as just indicated, they represented it in their fantasy themselves. But for anyone who's read MacDonald's essays, The Imagination, Its Functions and Its Culture, and The Fantastic Imagination, there is little that any of these gents say that is new. Rather, much that is reiterated from MacDonald. As an aside, I think it's worth remarking here on how important MacDonald believed his own essay on the imagination to be. He described it as one of the best things I think that I have ever done. And it's the only known lecture of hundreds over decades that MacDonald ever gave from a fully written text. He would sometimes use notes off of which he'd riff, but this is the only lecture he ever gave out of hundreds from which he spoke the complete written text. And he frequently offered this lecture as an option. You will see in his letters, it's often an option he gives in the lectures that he's proffering. Before it appeared as the opening essay in A Dish of Orts, which is where you can now find it, easily accessible online, he published a part of it anonymously in 1867, and it later appeared in at least 3 journals: the British Quarterly Review, Scott's Monthly Magazine, and New York's Eclectic Magazine of Foreign Literature. I can't yet prove that Barfield had read these essays by MacDonald, but he was certainly a MacDonald fan. He gifted Lewis with MacDonald books and encouraged Lewis to read more MacDonald. Regardless of whether Barfield read those essays or not, Barfield and MacDonald were certainly drawing on some of the same sources. Malcolm Guite, Trevor Hart, Gisela Kreglinger have given considered attention to MacDonald's extensive engagement with Barfield's literary mentor, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But without question, both men were also referencing Philip Sidney. In his conversations with Lewis and Tolkien, clearly articulated in his important book, Poetic Diction, Barfield drew attention to Philip Sidney, whom I only later realized was of immense significance to MacDonald, and specifically to Sidney's discussion of poets and poetry. As you may know, Sidney, in his defense for poetry, uses examples such as Aesop's fables and the biblical story of David and Nathan as proof of the educational power of poetry. So when he uses the word poetry, he's using that expansively. Perhaps for the moment, one could even substitute the term creative writing, because as Barfield pointed out to Lewis and Tolkien, when discussing the term poet, Sidney essentially means creative writer, a maker, one who makes. Barfield details Sidney's explanation of how a maker studies nature, contemplates the ideas behind nature, and thus is able to deliver forth new makings. It is because of the act of contemplation, as a result of that contemplation upon that which lies outside of the maker, that he or she is able to then make something new. This applied not only to the contemplation of one's physical environment, but also to the contemplation of the makings of other makers, works of literature, music, art. Barfield explained that the term invention in the 17th century was not used quite like we use it today, noting that the verb invere meant to find. MacDonald, you may also recall if you know his work, emphasizes this in his discussion of the author as trouver, finder. One finds so that one is able to make. Tolkien coined another term in his response to this discussion, subcreation, being able to assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment, those are his words, beautiful words, to assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment of God's creation. Rather than an author-artist being a mini-creator, he or she was a type of co-creator. Humans did not create ex nihilo, from nothing, like the deity, but in response to, or perhaps even in reaction against something. Something found, something engaged, something related. Perhaps even, according to these authors, a type of participation. Tolkien and Lewis were particularly struck by Barfield's discussion of the ancient semantic unities of language and myth. Indeed, Tolkien claims his entire outlook was modified by it. Barfield pulled Lewis and Tolkien's attention back to a time when language and myth were so closely entwined that they could not really be separated. Not only was, say, spiritus the word for wind, and the word for spirit, and the word for breath, but each of those things was understood by means of their relation to the other. One understood what breath was because one knew what spirit was, because one knew what wind was. Therefore, one knew what breath was. Barfield believed that though words had once embodied this unified perception, consciousness had become increasingly fragmented as conceptual thinking developed. He hoped that someday humans would again be able to better reconcile the literal and the abstract with a renewed perception informed by the past, rather than merely reverting to it. It may help to remember that these Inklings discussions are concurrent with the futurist movement, which was arguing for liberation from the weight of the past. Quite a different thing. Now, Lewis and Tolkien concurred that a decision to seek renewed perceptions informed by the past must apply to their creative crafting if it applied their philosophies of life. And they recognized that this necessitated informed and intentional engagement with their literary past. And so, as teachers and as writers, they modeled this. Tolkien drew upon the Northern European myths, such as Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas, and British sources such as the Mabinogi and William Morris. Lewis's work is not only rampant with Lucius Apuleius, Dante, Milton, Spenser, etc., but also with near contemporaries, such as Mauriac, Haggard, Chesterton, and MacDonald. Both Lewis and Tolkien came to be recognized for this careful attention to and engagement with the stories they were studying and teaching, as well as for manifesting delight in what Lewis called source hunting, rooting around, being trouveurs, finding the roots of the text they were reading and studying those that had come before. Their great skills at doing this enverre, this finding, resulted eventually in their own rich inventions, subcreations. Tolkien called this carefully intentional apprehension and engagement, which shaped the subsequent creative transmission, an act of mythopoeia. Their recognition of a literary lineage and the choice to actively engage with it, not just to recognize it, not just to borrow from it, but to seek it out, to try to understand it, to even converse with it, underscores the relational element that must be considered in order to understand mythopoiesis in the tradition of the Inklings. In light of this, did the Inklings' discussion of the mythopoeic lead me to gain a deeper understanding of MacDonald as an author, even as a fantasist? Was this apprehension and studied engagement shaping the subsequent transmission in new forms, representative of MacDonald's apparently mythopoeic writing? Were his tales, claimed by so many to transcend time, to invite personal transformation, intentionally informed by those that had gone before? Was MacDonald more than just referencing and borrowing symbols secondhand, but rather actually as interested in multiple literatures of the past as these Oxford literature professors who sought to craft their fantastical stories with the same sort of literary engagement they modeled in their classes and in their academic writings? Well, in short, yes. It didn't take me long to discover that a close reading of any of MacDonald's writings will indicate that he is very intentional, very intentionally rooting himself in the tradition of apprehension, engagement, and transmission. In fact, I suspect that this is one of the pedagogies to which Lewis, who had an equivalent encyclopedic mental library, was referring when he calls MacDonald his master. I decided to count the explicit references to other books and authors within MacDonald's first realistic novel, David Elginbrod, and I discovered over 90. This number only includes obvious references, not the myriad of allusions or unmarked quotations that also exist. Many of those 90 references, whilst implicitly shaping the story, are discussed in detail by the novel's characters or by the narrator. And every single one of those 90 references, in some way or other, contributes to or engages with the main storyline. Not one, should you pick up the thread and follow, is irrelevant. The clearly evident literary influences upon MacDonald's works alone number in the hundreds, and he is careful to draw explicit attention to many of them. This is not the case of simply borrowing ideas. This is something quite other. So I wondered, how did MacDonald, the former preacher, get here? A few years into my research on MacDonald, I no longer considered him the Wonder Boy aberration, not now that I knew more about the riches of its upbringing, even before he went off to university and discovered yet new literature. But still, from congregationalist preacher to a pretty literarily focused author, it'd be one thing if it was mostly just biblical references that I was finding in his work, or even some patristic or medieval mystics. And as some of you know, there's no shortage of those in MacDonald's work. But once I started looking, I realized that MacDonald's corpus as a whole is an entire literature of Western Civ compendium. Well, that's where, after years of studying MacDonald, years of wonderfully musty archives, I was finally brought up short. I finally did the math. It took me a long time. I did the math and I met the mentor. First, the math. MacDonald was a minister in Arundel for 28 months. 28 months in his early 20s. Incidentally, if you're not familiar with how unsensationalist it was that his first appointment in the Congregational Church was terminated, particularly in that parish at Arundel, it's worth investigating. He actually hung in there longer and better than his predecessors. In contrast to those 28 months, MacDonald was a professor of English literature for 10 years in his 30s, a decade, and a lecturer on English literature for 40 years. Now, this may be no revelation to some of you. For me, waking up to this fact was my biggest paradigm shift as a MacDonald scholar. This man I was studying was not a preacher author, let alone a failed preacher. He was a teacher author, and a very successful one. One who, incidentally, was in huge demand to preach for the majority of his life. He turned down highly paid offers to become minister in various churches. But a man who refused to ever receive payment for the preaching that he did do. He'd preach as a gift. His teaching of literature was his paid profession. And it was his profession, his vocation, not just a nice little sideline. MacDonald was passionate about teaching literature. That was clearly evident even in his novels, in which, while there's certainly the contemporary show of preaching therein as well, there's a considerable amount of literary exegesis. But something started to strike me as distinctive about MacDonald's lectures. With the exception of Dante, MacDonald only ever lectured on British authors. And then I realized that his published non-fictionalized literary criticism, little of it that there is, was also only on British writers, starting with a review of Browning in his 20s, and including his anthology of Philip Sidney, his study of Hamlet, and of course, England's Antiphon. Suddenly I had a new twist in my journey. Why only British literature plus Dante? Especially when it's clear that MacDonald loved German literature, and he loved French literature, and he loved classical literature. He loved Russian literature. Why not lecture on these things too? Well, that brought me to the mentor. After 28 months in Arundel, you may recall that MacDonald moved to Manchester. And the reason he moved there was to be near his mentor, the man to whose lectures MacDonald had dragged his friends and fellow students and his fiancée when he was still in seminary. The man under whom MacDonald had chosen to study and named as his greatest influence other than his father. I knew his name, A.J. Scott. My recollection from the biographies was that Scott was a pastor. What I did not know, and was amazed to discover, was his claim to fame. A.J. Scott was the first ever full-time English literature professor. All we have time for this morning is tantalizing tidbits, and truly I could talk to you about Scott for hours. It's not without reason that MacDonald chose him as his mentor. He was an amazing person. Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Frédéric Chopin, they all agree. But what's particularly important to underscore here in our exploration of the Victorian roots of modern fantasy is that this mentor, Scott, was, like MacDonald, Tolkien, and Lewis, a passionate teacher of literature. Like MacDonald, Tolkien, and Lewis, Scott read widely in multiple languages, and his taste was by no means restricted to English literature. Indeed, letters show that MacDonald spent lots of time in those first years of acquaintance with Scott reading German Romantic fairy tales from Scott's own library. And Scott not only introduced MacDonald to Italian texts, but even to real-life Italian revolutionaries. But although Scott himself found it fascinating to spend hours in the British Library, delving into early manuscripts such as those of Bede and Chaucer, he was struck at how few of his well-educated English acquaintances could even adequately converse about the literature of their own country. At Oxford and Cambridge, the literature that was studied was classical literature, Greek and Roman, sometimes a bit of continental lit. It was assumed that anything British would be studied on one's leisure time. But the reality was that most people weren't studying it on their leisure time. In fact, in one of his lectures, Scott opines that while there seemed to be a growing interest in the Nibelungen, he could scarcely find a person who even cared about Beowulf. He claims the prevalent English tone was that of disdain for their own ancient literature, tending to be particularly disparaging, while yet remaining ignorant of pre-Reformation literature. Scott's concerns, however, were no means limited to his educated friends. He also, along with his colleague F.D. Maurice and other such social reformers, the Robert Faulkners of their day, were involved in setting up multiple institutions that offered university education to those who could not, at that time, earn a degree from Cambridge or Oxford. It was a rather extensive list of humans, including not only working class men or any class of women, but also anyone not part of the Church of England. Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, atheists, Jews could not graduate from either Cambridge or Oxford. Scott, and Maurice for that matter, was not just insistent that all persons should have the opportunity to receive higher level education. He believed that it was an important aspect of self-identity for an individual as well as for a community to know the stories of one's heritage. In fact, Scott believed that his students would be better readers of foreign literature and better neighbors to other cultures for understanding who they themselves were and from whence they came. Scott was particularly concerned about the widespread disintegration of long-term community that had been occurring throughout the Industrial Revolution and which showed no signs of abating. He firmly believed that an effective way of fighting the unraveling of identity was to proactively reroot people in the stories of their identity. And so Scott, in his lectures, focused increasingly on British literature, British history, British philosophy, whether when lecturing to the upper class folks at various cultural institutes or to workers down in London's Docklands. With F.D. Maurice and Thomas Carlyle, Scott also worked to establish public lending libraries so that the gift of literacy was not stymied by a lack of accessible material. Eventually, in 1848, University College London appointed Scott as their first full-time English literature professor, where he taught students about Beowulf and Chaucer and Bede and Shakespeare and Milton and Sidney. A still revolutionary thing to do. Scott actually had to defend the choice and argue for the importance of studying these British authors in his public lectures. I do want to emphasize here, Scott was passionate about literature from all cultures. According to his students, he could even reference texts from the Quran, the Vedas, sacred Zoroastrian texts without notes to hand. But he believed that for Brits to better understand their current story, the one that they were living, they needed to know the stories, the literature, the history that fed into that. Recognizing those roots would enable them to see how other literatures and stories had also contributed to and shaped their own. It would, in fact, fend against xenophobia and xenophobic nationalism. Knowing one's identity better equipped one for dialogue, and dialogue across the ages and between disparate cultures greatly interested Scott. He believed that despite the changes and differences from Homer to Plato to Dante to Chaucer to Shakespeare on up to Elizabeth Gaskell, one could identify a continuum of common threads, common signs, and common truths. And these commonalities, according to Scott, demanded attention. Now, Scott's one non-English exception, as his lectures became more focused on Brits, was the same exception made by MacDonald, Dante. Why? A number of Scott's obituaries actually name A.J. Scott as the top Dante scholar of the age. Both Ruskin and Carlyle agree with this. And Scott explained his passion for Dante repeatedly in lectures. He details how Dante was revolutionary in writing in his own everyday language, so that, and Dante himself was explicit on this point, a broader audience of everyday Italians could read his work. Scott emphasized the deep reverence Dante had for stories and poetry that had preceded him. How Dante believed that close reading of some of these had actually transformed his own worldview. Also, how Dante's desire to both communicate and replicate this transformation informed and enriched his own writing. While Dante was not one of the Brits Scott believed England needed to rediscover and learn to read well, I believe Scott allotted this particular attention to Dante because Dante so completely embodied the message Scott was passionate to convey. Dante modeled that continuum of common threads, common signs, and common truths. His rigorous emphasis on rootedness in story, on communal responsibility to both persons and texts, on the general importance of communication and relationship, was Scott's own. The need to recognize and understand one's own identity-forming history, to glean intentionally from the stories that have shaped one's community and oneself, combined with the realization that humanity is called to carry forward the meta-narrative by its response to these communications, were resonances with Dante that became recurrent themes in Scott's lectures. Scott saw Dante as the transition to mark the new modern age because he was someone who explicitly drew upon the past so that he might speak to the present, preparing for the future. It sounds like Barfield in the mythopoeic discussion, right? As such, Scott believed that Dante's epic work continued to offer transformative insights right up to the 19th century. Scott urged his students to pay attention not only to the comedy, but to other engagements with the comedy in the centuries that followed. That Scott made an exception and spent so much time devoted to this particular reading, in the midst of his emphasis on British literature, sent me forward to a new passage of my journey to look a little more closely at MacDonald's own obsession and close scholarly engagement with Dante. I wasn't surprised to discover in that process that a mutual intimate friend of both Scott and MacDonald, John Ruskin, was also pretty passionate about Dante. Reading their various conversations with and about Dante gave me deeper insight and much greater delight in the Dantean aspects, implicit and explicit, of Lilith, which warrants about another 200 readings or so. Threading around those relationships sent me traveling back to some of the discussions about Dante in MacDonald's The Seaboard Parish, a book in which MacDonald engages with a bunch of Ruskin's concepts from modern painters, the book that MacDonald had given Louisa as an engagement present. While rereading Seaboard, I was suddenly struck by a passage that sounded really familiar. A discussion about spirit, breath, wind, and essentially their ancient semantic unity. Almost verbatim. Could Barfield have been inspired by Seaboard? I knew such a passage wasn't in Sidney's defense of poetry. I looked elsewhere in Sidney's writings, but could not find it. And then actually by accident, I found it in Ruskin's Sesames and Lilies. Of course, Barfield was conversing with Ruskin too. And just to keep things interwoven, that text of Sesame and Lilies had begun as a lecture Ruskin was giving in Manchester in 1864 because a professor that he greatly admired, named A.J. Scott, was raising money for public lending libraries and working class schools. I love how that's all intertwined. When I'd been poking around in Sydney this time, I was struck by how many of the shared emphases of both Scott and MacDonald were clearly iterated first by Sidney. Emphases reiterated yet again in Barfield, Lewis, and Tolkien, which makes sense. They are all arguing and modeling the same thing. Nothing comes from nothing. Story begets story. Poiesis evokes poiesis. Authors transformed by their reading of a text are likely to attempt to communicate some of that engagement in the works that they themselves choose to write. These authors believed and partook in the belief that the more relational they were as readers, seeking to find things, invere, in the works of others, the more inventive their own sub-creations would be. The writers I've mentioned this morning, Sidney, Dante, Scott, MacDonald, Tolkien, Lewis, they all believed that this was even a divine calling to intentionally delve deep into literature and respond in kind, to be trouveurs, finders, and thence makers. These men were incredible literature scholars. They read closely, engaged with the text, delved deep and imbibed, even chewed upon it. And thus was evoked fantastic new stories. Their imaginations were rich because they'd filled their coffers for years. And they do tell us that they're doing this. C.S. Lewis says, go to MacDonald. MacDonald says, go to Sidney. Go to Dante, to Wordsworth, to Shakespeare, to Goethe, to Herbert, to Plato, to Thoreau. A whole huge library into which they are inviting us. MacDonald uses the image in England's antiphon of an antiphonal choral song, one writer responding to the next, each building upon that which had been heard. He writes, no man could sing as he had sung, had not others sung before him. Deep answereth unto deep. The clearly evident voices to which MacDonald's work responds number in the hundreds, and he is careful to draw explicit attention to many of them. A close reading of any of MacDonald's writings will indicate that he is intentionally placing himself in this tradition of apprehension, engagement, and transmission. MacDonald even goes so far as to describe this as a relationship with writers of the past, saying that engaging this way can at times, quote, place in your hands a key to their inmost thoughts. They are not thoughts with which MacDonald always agrees. Even with his beloved Dante, he champions some ideas, he argues with others, and he suggests a different angle of approach to yet others. But repeatedly he, a good student of A.J. Scott, draws attention to the continuum of common threads, symbols, insights. MacDonald never engages with only one text in his creations. Rather, he is engaging in a conversation of texts, balancing arguments against each other, seeking those points of convergence. It is little wonder that libraries are the setting for so many important relational engagement in his novels. Of course they are. Look closely at an image or phrase, and you will see, say, how he is engaging with Ruskin's engagement with Blake's, engagement with Sidney's, engagement with Paul's, engagement with the Greek myth of Psyche, for example. The writers whom MacDonald references most frequently, repeatedly, are those who also intentionally place themselves in this tradition of literary conversation, a relational tradition that recognizes that its participants cannot stand alone. As to his effectiveness, well, that other encyclopedic brain Ruskin, who knew all of Britain's literati and intelligentsia, writes to MacDonald. Actually, he wrote this to MacDonald, but it was in a reference for a job for MacDonald. I am always glad to hear you lecture myself. And if I had a son, I would rather he took lessons in his literary taste under you than under any person I know. For you would make him more than a scholar. You would make him a living and thoughtful reader. Of all the literary men I know, I think you most love literature itself. The others love themselves and the expression of themselves, but you enjoy your own art and the art of others when it is fine. That's John Ruskin on George MacDonald. MacDonald himself writes that the best thing you can do for your fellow, next to rousing his conscience, is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him. Or say, to make him think things for himself. Now, while it seems to me that there are times in which MacDonald's own opinions do get in the way of his achieving this, it is clearly a goal of his. And certainly sufficient testimony exists that he has been successful with plenty of readers from the 19th century through to the 21st. Not only have his stories pointed readers to other pieces of literature by modeling discussions with them, but in doing so, he has successfully invited his readers into that conversation, to participate in it. Others have become trouvères, partaken, engaged, concurred, refuted, related. MacDonald repeatedly reminds his readers that stories not only require an active relationship to fulfill their purpose of being told, the engagement of a reader or listener, they also require relationship to enable their very existence. Stories evolve from the response of the writer or teller to external forces, humans, animals, natures. A story is an expression of relationship that seeks to relate. Relationship requires effort. Literary relationships as well as personal ones. Some of us are more like the character Vane in MacDonald's Lilith, or Stoddart in Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, better at hiding in books and avoiding the complications and taxations of people. But some of us are actually more like the little ones in Lilith, who haven't even really tried to learn. I think I have my spells of being each. MacDonald dares to say that if one must judge, to be the latter is better than the former. To understand, he writes, is not more wonderful than to love. Still, he is very clear. To love without making an effort to understand is problematic. He details this with the little ones. To be a sub-creator, MacDonald, and Tolkien and Lewis after him, believed that one must study the works of creation closely, with intention. Nothing comes from nothing. The more rich the foundation, the fount from which one's ink is drawn, the more rich the new creation. The greater the depth of engagement with what has come before, the greater the dimensionality of the new creations that follow. Creations likely, says MacDonald, to carry even more meaning than the authors had intended. In plain speak, should you yourselves wish to write fantasy, they would argue that the more intentional you are about reading texts that have engaged in that long conversation, and about reading such texts deeply, carefully, actually engaging with them, developing a type of relationship with them, spending time, the better your own fantastical writing will be. You'll be less likely to have mythopoeic slapped on by an optimistic publisher, and more likely to go down in the annals as a mythopoeic writer in the tradition of the Inklings and MacDonald. A storycrafter because one is a story scholar, and even more importantly, a story lover. So forget the small town boy who broke free from his repressive religious background into the forbidden delights of Romanticism. Forget the penniless preacher forced to write fiction to feed his kids. Consider instead the farm boy raised in a world rich with story and imagination, of multiple genres, and with a love of science and of creation. Consider the young man encouraged by his father to explore theology and discover mentors worthy of admiration. And consider one of English literature's earliest teachers, mentored by its first ever full-time prof. A Celt who was fluent in German literature and French literature, who read daily in Hebrew and Greek, who knew Shakespeare inside out, who wanted everyone to know his friends, Dante and Sidney and Herbert. A teacher author, passionate to draw others into a potentially transformative conversation of story upon story, agreeing, disagreeing, interweaving through genre and culture to recognize patterns and convergences from classical and biblical through patristic and Celtic, medieval and Renaissance, up through Romantic and beyond, and then to respond to them, to evoke new perceptions. Beware of pigeonholing MacDonald into a category. Beware even more of pigeonholing his influences. In the wealth of the stories that begat his own, you will find the roots of 20th and 21st century fantasy, roots that will continue threading well into the centuries yet to come. Personally, I've discovered that the more effort I make to get to know the many disparate writers to whom MacDonald proffers introductions, and the more I learn from my colleagues about who and what they've discovered, the further I progress in my own journey of understanding MacDonald as a writer. It's an ongoing process. I have had to let go of many preconceptions and misconceptions along the way, and I've no doubt that that will continue to be the case. But in trying to come to grips with what Lewis and Tolkien meant when they called MacDonald a mythopoeic writer, I think I've come to a place of better understanding of what makes their own fantasy as rich as it is. It's not pastiche. It's not secondhand symbols. Lots of such fantasy novels do exist and are currently being written. But there are also fantasy writers, living and thoughtful readers, such as Gaiman, Overstreet, Trafton, Peterson, Clark, Sorensen, who, like Tolkien and Lewis and MacDonald, have read deeply, widely, well, who value dearly the conversations that have gone before, even those with which they do not agree, and who are now relating their own inventions, who love the mythopoeic art. Those authors who pioneered the way for modern fantasy were convinced that writers must be transformed by engagement with others before they could give voice to something new, especially if that work was to invite transformative insights or experiences for the reader. To stand in the tradition of mythopoeic story is to both receive and to be part of passing on that which is infused with the myths that have gone before, rooting oneself in an inheritance of participation. For me, this discovery was a golden key to the pioneering fantasy of teacher-author George MacDonald. Thank you.